Sigma, a hero that went from very reliable and strong in Overwatch 1, even after the nerfs, to weakened and dying out in the current day of Overwatch 2. He was a staple of the double shield composition that terrorized lobbies back in 6v6, and even in 5v5, he still seemed to have a place on a select few escort maps such as Havana and Circuit Royale, where he could play at a far enough distance to get the most value out of his ability to absorb and deal ranged damage. Even today, there's this expectation and understanding that Sigma is still quite strong on these longer maps. But if you look at professional matches from the most recent OWCS Stage 2, you'll actually struggle to find Sigma, even on Circuit Royale. Teams will run Ramatra, Orisa, and even D.Va when this is supposed to be Sigma's map. So, what happened? Where'd Sigma go? And was he ever all that good in 5v5 in the first place? Those are the most important questions that we will approach today. To start, let's talk about what Sigma is good at, which is his ability to absorb ranged damage. He's great at it. He's able to more consistently and more flexibly block range damage than any other tank in the game. Sigma is able to use his primary fire and use his rock while his shield is up. And when his shield gets too low, he is able to cycle out using his kinetic grasp, which adds to his survivability. Taking into account his HP pool, shield, and grasp, he's able to take a lot of ranged hits while also managing to deal damage and actively take space in the process. Ramatra, on the other hand, can't deal damage or move quickly while holding block, and his shield is not as flexible as Sigma's. Ramatra can absolutely take a lot of punishment, but all he can do while taking that damage is hold down an existing position or act as an anchor on the objective. D.Va also has drawbacks. She only has one ability to easily block range damage, Defense Matrix, and she can't shoot during it, and it simply doesn't last as long as Sigma's cooldown rotation, otherwise known as a CD rotation. We could look at more examples, but I think you get the point. Sigma is just a sponge for range damage. So, Sigma's CD rotation of shield and grasp allows him to live through a ton of range damage. But on the flip side, as you might expect, he isn't as good at dealing with a more balanced, brawlier composition that likes to get up close and personal. This means that when Sigma is matched up against a brawl composition, he cannot anchor or hold down a position like Ramatra can with his block. Instead, he has to hold down the S key and pray to Aaron Keller that the enemy Mei will miss her wall and he won't instantaneously explode to the hands of the enemy Ramatra running straight towards him. If you wanted the answers to why Sigma isn't played often, that's pretty much it. He struggles to anchor and often needs to continually give up space until his team has an opportunity or advantage of some sort, unless he's in a mirror or up against a composition that generally, can't run him over. And it isn't just Ramatra compositions that can overwhelm Sigma, because we saw once again decimate Virtus.pro's Sigma composition back in the Hangzhou LAN with D.Va after Ramatra was banned. And for reference, this is the best Western Sigma team in the world. They were completely outclassed. So, now that we understand what Sigma is bad at, why is he so weak in the modern day considering his great strength of absorption? Now, when we think of Sigma compositions, we normally think of what we consider to be poke compositions. Yet, what you see Virtus.pro playing here against once again is a brawl composition. In fact, both teams are running brawl compositions, the Juno Brig backline with the Sojourn Genji DPS lineup. Just look at Mew's POV on Brig, you can see how once again are trying their absolute best to get him in there to brawl. That's the goal of these compositions, to brawl. This is a very important concept, and please try to be open-minded about this. Individual heroes are not brawl, dive, or poke, or really anything else. D.Va can be used in brawl compositions and dive compositions. We generally label compositions depending on what they are best at or what best reflects their win condition. In this composition, Lige's D.Va is not playing to dive the backline. He is playing to enable a brawl with Mew on Brig. The same goes for Vistola on Sigma. He is playing to help his team and his Brigitte brawl as well. Now, when we are considering what hero is better, Sigma or D.Va, in these specific brawl compositions, we have to think about who is the best fit and has the best abilities to assist their team in winning fights and also counter the opposing team. This is where Sigma's specialization comes back to bite him. D.Va is not the best at anchoring or brawling on the whole tank roster, but she is still better than Sigma. Sigma, on the other hand, can't get much use out of his specialization of absorbing range damage because there isn't much to absorb from the side of once again in the first place. In a brawl mirror, other tank heroes simply beat Sigma. So if that's the case, why are Virtus.pro playing a brawl composition rather than a classic pokier composition? Well, that's because no matter what you do, it always comes back to brawl. Let's create a hypothetical situation to demonstrate this. We have Team A and Team B, and they are playing on Circuit Royale, one of the best Sigma maps in the game. Team A is attacking while Team B is defending. Let's say Team B start out their defense with a classic Sigma poke composition. They run double flex support, Baptiste plus Zenyatta, and they also run double hit scan / main DPS, Sojourn plus Freya. Now, this composition with Sigma, Bap, Zen, Freya, Sojourn is essentially the equivalent to putting every skill point you have into one stat or ability in an RPG. Team B are putting everything into ranged damage, and what happens if you do that? Everything else suffers. The only reason why teams even consider compositions similar to this is because Circuit Royale has super long sightlines that allow you to abuse range damage a bit more. But does that entirely make up for the greediness of such a composition? Well, it took us a few years, but we figured out the answer is no. Some teams, pretty early on in Overwatch 2's meta development, realized that to counter these full-range Sigma compositions, you could run Sigma in a Brawl composition to absorb the damage and buy enough time to close the distance. A popular example being Sigma, Sojourn, Mei, Bap, Lucio. There are other options, but we're going to use this one as an example. Team A, being the smart team that they are, decide to run a Sigma Brawl composition, and this leaves them with quite the advantage. Team A's Sigma player is able to take full advantage of Sigma's strengths and is able to use his CD rotation to its fullest extent to absorb the range damage from Team B's poke composition. Meanwhile, Team B's Sigma player suffers, constantly getting walled off by the Mei and generally run over. He's not able to do as much to absorb range damage since he has less to absorb, and he's constantly forced into situations where he must brawl when he does not want to. So, what's the correct decision for Team B if their Sigma poke composition is getting run over by Team A's Sigma brawl composition? Well, they mirror it. Team B swap their Zenyatta to Lucio, and they swap their Freya to Mei, and all of a sudden, both teams are in a brawl mirror. We're not done yet though, because Team A have a great idea. They realize that, oh, we're in a brawl mirror now, and what beats Sigma in a brawl mirror? Ramattra. And if Ram isn't available, D.Va and Orisa are always options. This leaves us with Team A's Ramattra Brawl composition running over Team B's Sigma Brawl composition. So, if you're Team B, what do? You just mirror them again. And then, after a whole map of Circuit Royale, both teams ended up on Brawl, and Team B simply couldn't succeed in forcing Sigma. It all comes back to Brawl. Teams have learned their lesson over the course of the past few years regarding greedy compositions. Trying to put all your stat points in one place is really risky, and this is why we kind of have the roles of hitscan / main DPS, flex DPS, main support, and flex support in the first place. When you have one of each role rather than doubling up, you tend to have a composition that has more balanced stats, and is therefore more capable of dealing with more situations. That does not apply all the time, but a lot of the time that is the case. That also means that heroes that play too much into one stat tend to be left behind or are very situational, and Sigma's a great example. Extreme heroes are best used to counter extreme compositions, and that's why Sigma is best utilized when up against the most overkill, range damage based compositions in the game. Actually, my most recent Hanzo video is a good example of this as well. Hanzo counters Lifeweaver, but only because Lifeweaver compositions help create the more extreme conditions that allow Hanzo to thrive. To go even deeper into this concept, to best counter extreme compositions, which we sometimes call cheese compositions, you're better off responding with the opposite extreme to counter it and shut it down. If you try and play your average meta Ramattra composition against a Pokey or Sigma composition, you might actually lose, because your Ramattra will take quite a bit of poke and he isn't built to handle that as effectively. It's better to play a composition you wouldn't normally see, Sigma Brawl, to beat Sigma Poke, even though Sigma Brawl would lose to your average, typical meta Ramattra Brawl composition. Although we often treat meta like it is very simple, and one composition is just objectively better than another, it's really much more complex. What we consider to be meta are usually the compositions that we believe are the strongest, and also the most consistent. They tend to have very balanced stat points as well, capable of doing a lot of different things, but nothing to an extreme extent. To come full circle, teams essentially realized that Sigma compositions could be countered easily, so starting on Sigma presented quite a big risk, and far fewer teams take that risk in the modern day. So, Sigma isn't useless in modern 5v5, and there are times when he's optimal, but mostly as a counter to certain greedy ranged damage compositions. So, why then was Sigma better in 6v6, and also why was he hard meta at one point during 5v5? Well, for 6v6, back in Overwatch 1, we had 2 tanks rather than 1. Sigma still had the same exact strengths and weaknesses, but he had another tank on his team to make up for those weaknesses. Sigma was famously played with Orisa in double shield, and it just so happens that in Overwatch 1, Orisa was the best tank in the entire game at anchoring and holding down a position. She could also cycle her shield and fortify alongside Sigma's shield and grasp, allowing for even more mitigation of ranged damage. Orisa made up for the weaknesses of Sigma and actually pushed his strengths even further, which allowed for more balanced compositions built around the double shield tank frontline. When Overwatch 2 came around and switched the format to 5v5, plenty of heroes were left behind. Reinhardt, for example, lost the support of the D.Va who would control high grounds and angles for him, which was key in allowing Reinhardt compositions to function. Teams made up for this by using Symmetra TP strats to move the Reinhardt around, but those strats are challenging and time-consuming to learn, making them impractical even for professional teams. Sigma was left in a similar situation. He used to be playable on many different maps in Overwatch 1, but in Overwatch 2, he was, at least in the beginning, mostly stuck on Circuit Royale and Havana with old-school Poke-style compositions. Teams were still running these double hitscan / main DPS and double flex support compositions, almost out of habit from what they were used to in Overwatch 1 with double shield. As Overwatch 2 progressed on, we eventually reached the World Cup meta of 2023, which saw Sigma compositions being played by nearly every team. These weren't Poke Sigma compositions though, rather they were Sigma Brawl compositions. This meta really popularized these Sig Brawl comps, and the reason why they were played was because Sigma was considered, at least according to scrim and tournament results, as the best brawl-oriented tank in the game in a majority of those matchups. And this is likely to be the only situation in which Sigma can be meta again. A meta where Sigma is so dominant and his stats are high enough as to where he's actually able to out-brawl the likes of Ramattra, Orisa, and D.Va. This of course means buffing Sigma to the point where he lacks weaknesses and he's ridiculously strong. When you have a hero that already specializes in something and then you buff them even more, you end up with a very unbalanced and one-sided meta. Basically, if Sig is going to be usable again outside of acting as a situational counter, he'll have to be strong enough to be the only valid option as long as he isn't banned. After this Sigma meta of the 2023 World Cup, and by the way, it's the real World Cup, not the sports washing one, Sigma was nerfed, and some of the other brawl-oriented tanks were also buffed. In my opinion though, these nerfs and buffs weren't enough to move the meta on their own. A lot of the meta changes we see and experience are often actually a result of constant evolution occurring in scrims, matches, and even the ranked ladder. In other words, we figured out that Sig wasn't that good, it wasn't necessarily that he was nerfed. Players likely figured out that Sigma, even in his decently strong state, wasn't the absolute best at brawling and would lose out to tanks like Ramattra or Orisa, and so Sigma was slowly phased out. The nerfs only sped up that process. And this slow process of evolution that is defined by the players is also the reason why Sigma was ever really popular in the first place on Circuit Royale and Havana. Teams were used to playing Poke compositions in Overwatch 1 with Sigma, so they just did it in Overwatch 2. Over time, the limits of such Sigma compositions have been tested, and with teams figuring out how effective Sig Brawl can be in 2023, the process was exponentially sped up, and now, in the modern day, Sigma Poke compositions have been mostly phased out. The meta, as we know it, is about trends and about taking calculated risk. The meta tends to travel from the top down. Top OWCS teams start playing something, lower OWCS teams copy. Faceit League teams then copy, and then content creators copy, and even the general player base watch these content creators, and then they copy. And that's how GOATs ended up in Plat. That's how that happened in Overwatch 1. These top teams, though, can only afford to take so many risks. They have only so many scrims, practice matches, to work with, so it's usually safer to stick with what they know. Remember that Team A and Team B example? That's what occurred over the course of several years that led us to Sigma being phased out of the meta. All of those different scenarios and matchups occurred over and over and over again until teams figured out what generally works the best. That means, yeah, teams have been running suboptimal and very risky Sigma Poke compositions for years, and for all we know, some other compositions we use right now could be fundamentally flawed too. As a final note, I want to actually present a question to all of you lovely viewers. Do you think that we should buff or even change Sigma's kit so that he's better at brawling and is more balanced with his stat points overall? Or do you think it's okay for Overwatch to have heroes like Sigma that act as specialists? It's an interesting question, and I want your thoughts on it. Personally, I think we can make minor changes to Sigma to allow him to brawl a bit more, but generally I think his niche is useful enough that he isn't too situational to be a good addition to the roster. This especially goes for places like Ranked, where players will very often run double hit scan / main DPS compositions and double flex support compositions that Sigma can help counter. Too situational can be bad, like Weaver or Mercy, but there's a balance, and Sigma isn't in the worst spot. This was a very different video. I hope it was at least informative. If you're at the end of this here and you're thinking, I have more questions than I feel like I have answers, that's actually okay, and that's perfectly fine. I went through so many different concepts and overall things in this video that I think you can make like 4 videos out of the things I've talked about today, and I might actually go into more specifics about this stuff in the future, and if you want to hear about that, let me know. I definitely went into a bit of a deep dive of the evolution of the meta, so please let me know if there's anything I can do to increase the quality so that I don't lose you and so that it's less confusing. Anyways, make sure to follow me on Twitch where I co-stream live OWCS matches, and make sure to leave a comment as well to help support me with some engagement. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.